Hey everybody, welcome to week 3. I hope you're doing the class as much as I am. Today and this week, we're staying on the theme of the relationship between attitudes and behaviors. To begin our narrative for this week and what we're going to focus on in these lectures and in this reading, I'd like to tell a quick story about among the most famous studies measuring the relationship between attitude and behavior. The study takes place in 1934, and the scholar's last name is Lapierre, and the Lapierre study has become kind of a very important, noteworthy study in the history of communication. Lapierre was very famously skeptical of questionnaires and the accuracy of questionnaires. Questionnaires were a fairly new instrument of research in the 1920s and 1930s, and he was among the first people to recognize that there's always a kind of self-presentation bias, self-awareness bias when people fill out surveys. And so the way that you see yourself or your aspirations for yourself might come through more than the truth of the matter when you're figuring out or filling out a questionnaire, or what you think the interviewer might want to hear is something that you might want to reflect in your answers. And these are called self-presentation biases in questionnaire research. And Lapierre is among the first people to question these, to highlight this error in research reporting based on questionnaires. That doesn't mean he threw the baby out with the bathwater. He still thought they were a valuable tool, at least to see how people thought about themselves, if not to get to the truth, but it should be supplemented. So what Lapierre is motivated by is not just this suspicion of questionnaires, but he's also interested in earlier research, especially from Allsport and others that we talked about a week and 2 weeks ago, saying that there was a really strong relationship between people's attitudes and their behaviors. They felt a way and they would act a way. They felt very strongly about going to church, therefore they would go to church. These are the kinds of ideas that Allsport and others were trying to link. And then, as I mentioned, Lapierre questioning questionnaires, but also questioning the causality of that link, attitudes causing behaviors, said, I'm not so sure. So what he did was, in addition to using questionnaires, he wanted to do an ethnographic study. An ethnographic study is where a researcher or a participant involves themselves in the very thing that they're studying. If you want to study, let's say, the productivity in a factory, you don't just measure factory productivity using some metrics over time. You actually involve yourself in it, observe it, and do first-person analysis of the data that you're gathering on the spot. So Lapierre famously set out in this 1934 study to link racist behaviors with racist attitudes, or the vice versa, racist attitudes with racist behaviors. And so what he did was he commissioned a couple of Chinese origin, a man and a woman, to travel around with him all along the West Coast in Oregon, in Washington State, and in Northern California, and to go to bars, to go to restaurants, to go to cafes, to go to campgrounds, to go to hotels, to go to any place where public service was given. They went to 251 different establishments over a 2-year period in roughly the early 1930s. And what he was interested in was patterns of evident discrimination. How many times would these folks of Chinese origin be refused service? How many times would they be given racial epithets were screamed at them? How many times were they kicked out? How many times would there just be subpar service? He was coding all these sorts of things. The way these would work is typically Lapierre would ask, and he paid this couple to do this, would ask the couple to go in first to the cafe, to the campground, and ask for whatever they were going to ask for. They'd ask for a room, they would ask for service, they would ask for coffee, and then he would end up joining later on. So it wasn't just measuring the relationship of how his participation and the knowledge that he was there with them, but just them on their own, and then he would come in later, 5-10 minutes later, and join them for coffee, for dinner, at the campground, wherever they were. 251 different establishments, only one time in this 2-year study where they refused service. Lapierre later said that he found no evident patterns of discrimination that were a little more subtle than refusal of service, for instance, name calling or subpar service or overcharging. None of these things. It seemed to him to be as ordinary as if he was patronizing these restaurants. Then, step 2, and this is where the attitudes and behaviors part come in. So he's measuring he's measuring behaviors in the first instance in these 251 different instances, and only finding one instance of outright discrimination in his point of view, compromised that it was in the mid-1930s. 2 months later, he sends out questionnaires to all 251 different establishments. 91% of the cafes that were asked the question, would they serve a couple of Chinese origin, said no, they would absolutely not serve a couple of Chinese origin. 92% of the hotels and campgrounds who were asked the question, would you serve a couple of Chinese origin who wanted to eat or drink or stay at your establishment? 92% said absolutely not. And so Lapierre found exactly what he was looking for, which is to say that 92% of campgrounds that they had patronized with a couple of Chinese origin said they would never serve a couple of Chinese origin, and yet he personally experienced with a couple of Chinese origin what he considered to be very ordinary, all the way to excellent service. And then the same was true with 91% of bars, restaurants, etc. So in his mind, he had exploded the relationship there. And then a similar study just a few years later corroborated this, replicated it. Corey, the very famous communications scholar whose last name is Corey, 1937, replicated this study by giving students a questionnaire about their attitudes towards cheating. All of them virtually said that they were extremely anti-cheating. And then they gave them a quiz on a subject and a reading that they had just done, a fairly difficult reading, and then asked them to self-grade their own work. Unbeknownst to them, their quizzes after they had taken them had been taken and actually graded by the researcher who was doing this, and then they were given the answers. And what we found was fairly routine cheating that they could verify because they graded this ahead of time by the students who had also said just 10 minutes before that they were routinely anti-cheating. So coupled with Lapierre, the Corey study just a few years later in the 1930s seems to explode this relationship, really complicate the relationship between attitudes and behaviors. And by the 1960s, the kind of famous linkages between attitudes and behaviors like Allsport had found in the 1930s, nobody could replicate that stuff. And so scholars overwhelmingly were wondering, why are we even studying attitudes to begin with? They're notoriously unreliable. Oftentimes people don't even know how they feel about a thing. They just behave the way they behave because of tradition or the spur of the moment decision making or problematic perceptions of reality or because other people want them to. And so why do we care what people say they think? Why don't we just study behaviors? If one person's behavior changes over time, we can sort of assume perhaps they've been persuaded to behave differently or cajoled, manipulated, seduced to behave differently, whatever you want to call it. And so out of this growth of research really spurred on by Lapierre and Corey in the 1930s, crescendos in the late 1960s with scholars openly questioning, let's just throw the baby out completely, pardon the metaphor, and only study behaviors. And so what this actually spurs, and this is our topic for today's lecture, is two strains of research. One is a new theory juxtaposing the relationship between attitudes and behaviors, and the second strain of research is a strain on new moderating variables to tighten and clarify the relationship between attitudes and behaviors. So one group of scholars says, yes, perhaps we should just throw attitudes out altogether and only study behaviors, but the two strains of research we're going to focus on are additions to the study and the relationship between attitudes and behaviors, coming out of the Lapierre study, crescendoing in the calls to reject attitudes altogether in the 1960s and where that went in the 70s, 80s, and all the way up to today.